Hello, this is Claus Jensen presenting a game from the Dortmund 2012 tournament. And it was played. This game was played between the tournament winner Sergey Karjakin from Russia and the local hope Jan Gustafsson, who didn't have a good tournament. He was simply overmatched in this tournament. He scored only 3 draws in 9 games, and the other 6 games were all lost. And in this game, Karjakin is white and he opens e4. And Gustafsson tries the Caro-Kann defense, which is known to be quite a solid defense against 1e4, but perhaps also slightly passive. d4, d5, knight c3, d takes, knight takes, bishop f5. This is the main line of the Caro-Kann, and then comes this h4 move, threatening h5. And a move that is not played very often is h5, because it prevents white from playing h5 and chasing the bishop, and but it gives white the g5 square. And in some cases, the h5 pawn is also a target of the black castle's kingside, and is therefore no longer protected by the rook. So the normal move is h6, knight f3, knight d7, and then h5. And after having chased the bishop back to h7, then white plays bishop d3, which is perfectly normal. And it may look a little strange that white chases the bishop back to h7 only to trade it off one move later, but with this move order, white has had the h5 move for free, so to speak. He has won a tempo, you could say. e6 follows, bishop d2, knight gf6, and white castles queenside, bishop e7, king b1, and this is pretty much the main line in the classical Caro-Kann. Knight e4 from Karjakin, Gustafsson takes, knight f6, queen e2, queen d5, bishop e3, and note here that knight takes h5 doesn't work because of knight e5, and then the knight on h5 is hanging, goes back to f6, but then bishop takes h6 is strong. G takes, rook d3, rook f to d8, queen d2, bishop f8, queen f4. Moves like this. f6, knight is hanging, queen g3 is a threat, h6 pawn is hanging. Very strong attack for white. So, after bishop e3, then h5 cannot be taken. And Gustafsson here plays knight g4, bishop back to c1, and knight f6. And once again, Karjakin has had a free move. He has, in fact, moved his bishop from d1, d2 to c1. Another option, instead of going back with knight f6 here, was perhaps rook f to d8, then knight e5, knight takes, d takes, queen a5. This has been played a few times, and although white won these games, black seems to be okay at this point. But of course, white has an obvious plan. He can play rook to the g file and play g4, g5. So, of course, still white has the easier game. So, Gustafsson played his knight back to f6, and then came knight e5. Queen e4 from Gustafsson, and Karjakin doesn't want to trade off queens here, so queen f1, c5, f3, and now comes a very interesting choice from Gustafsson. I don't think it wasn't perhaps the best choice he made here, but because rather than keeping his queen centralized on d5, he preferred to stay on the h7 b1 diagonal, and perhaps he did this to help in defense of the king. And to keep some pressure on c2, but so queen h7 was the move that Gustafsson played. D takes c5, bishop takes c5, and knight d7. This is now possible because the queen is not on d5. Knight takes d7, rook takes, and now a rook on the 7th rank is always nice, and clearly Karjakin has some advantage here, but how big is it? That's the big question here. Gustafsson plays rook a to c8, and he now threatens to the c2 pawn if the bishop on the c5 moves. And here Karjakin rejected to take the pawn on b7. He could have played rook takes b7 here. Then bishop b6 and this attack on the c2 pawn. Queen has to defend. And with rook c6, and then perhaps g4 and rook f to c8, well, then black has some pressure on c2, and this is a little bit unpleasant for Karjakin. So he rejected this line. So instead of taking the pawn on b7, he played g4 immediately, because now, after bishop b6 and the attack on c2, he can play rook h2. And this is a much better line for white. And this was, of course, the idea of this g4 move on the previous move. And what should Gustafsson do to keep being in the game here? I think this is a critical point in the game. And Gustafsson must have had several candidate moves in this position. He could perhaps have considered rook c6 with the idea of doubling rooks in the c-file, adding more pressure on c2. Or he might have considered e5, perhaps, to play e4, to again free the queen, which is locked on h7. He could also try rook f to d8 to remove this rook on the 7th rank. And another way to move this rook on the 7th rank could be rook c7. So there were several candidate moves, but in the game Gustafsson plays a very aggressive move, a very aggressive approach. He plays f5 here. And perhaps he was hoping for rook takes b7, because then f takes g4. And now there's some nice pressure in the f file. And perhaps f4 was necessary here, but now the queen has some squares, e4, f5, and so on. So this was perhaps what Gustafsson was hoping for, but Karjakin, he played queen e2 here, eyeing the e6 pawn. And now, if for example rook c6 here, to defend the pawn on e6, and still planning this doubling of rooks in the c-file, then g5, ace takes, bishop takes, and if doubling rooks here, then comes h6, which is very strong for white. And the g7 pawn is pinned by the rook. So this is very strong. And another option was perhaps rook f to e8 here to defend the pawn. And again g5 is a move, h takes and bishop takes. And again this h6 is in the air. So in the game Gustafsson plays f takes g4, but then simply queen takes e6 check, and Karjakin has now won a pawn, and it seems that Gustafsson has absolutely no compensation for the pawn. Karjakin is winning at this point. Rook c to e8, rook g2, adding more pressure on g7. Rook has to defend on g8. Bishop d2, planning to go to c3 and add even more pressure on g7. Rook e5 came, and now if bishop c3, rook g5, queen h3, rook takes, queen takes, is still very good for white. Black is almost in Zugzwang here, so this would also clearly be winning, but Karjakin played a4 here. Then came bishop a5, and now that the black bishop has left the b6 g1 diagonal, then queen d4 is possible, and rook takes h5, bishop takes, rook takes, and now comes rook g takes g7. And it seemed that the g7 was sufficiently defended, but it actually turned out not to be, because the problem for black is that rook takes g7 is now met by rook d8 check. And black loses the queen, because he has to avoid the mate with queen g8. And then comes rook takes and king takes. And you could say, okay, 2 rooks for a queen, but queen d8 check. And now the rook on a5 is falling. and therefore white has a clearly won game with queen against rook. So after rook takes g7 here, Jan Gustafsson resigned the game. I think it was a very nice game from Karjakin, and of course Gustafsson played this very questionable queen h7, I think, and very questionable f5 move, which lost him a pawn and also the game. But still, nice stuff from Karjakin, and thanks for watching this video, and please visit my chess website at clausjensen.com. Bye bye for now.